Good to go.
Oh, great. Hi everyone. I'm Pranav, Spell. We're DCAs for USUDC. We're going to do sort of a PMLO exchange and then sort of like a rough training session on the following motion, which is the Novice Semifinals. The motion reads, this house opposes Guerrilla Filmmaking. I'll give the PM, then we'll give the LO, and then we'll chat afterwards. So great. Let me set up my timer. Right. Will start my speech in three, two, one, go. Some setup and then two arguments on why this is terrible and why the alternative of documentary filmmaking is better. Firstly, a clarification. This is not all independent filmmaking. We can still access many short films or many movies that are made on smaller budgets as compared to big blockbuster filmmaking, anyways. Guerrilla filmmaking has the following features that are unique to it. One, they often have to operate without permits, without the permission of people that they are filming. And two, they're obviously a far, far smaller budgets, right? So micro budgets, very tiny number of crew in many instances. And the way it's always likely to be done without taking permits, without having the permissions of people, is because for many people, it's often just way more convenient, especially if they're working outside the studio system, for them to indulge in these mechanisms. And these are really, really bad. Firstly, I want to talk about why these are bad in and of themselves, and having less of them is benefit, and having less of them is a good thing. There are six reasons that I have for this. The first is that they often incur significant legal risks. Obviously, filming without people's permission or on different people's properties without their permission is something that is liable to make you be sued, especially when you try and release it in a specific short film festival or like release it out publicly anyways. And this is obviously quite bad because one, it can often run the risk of bankrupting the filmmaker or other individuals, right? It can make the lives of, say, extras who may not even know what kind of film they're filming in is worse. Like often you have, say, the average grip not be someone who has access to the screenplay, but just listen to the directions of the director because the screenplay may be undergoing changes when the movie is being made so very quickly or spontaneously. And all of those means that people who aren't even like consenting into what the kind of film is being made are being sued for it and can often run the risk of ruining their lives in many instances. And this is something that the director may originally think that it's worth doing because, it's very unlikely to happen. It can easily be thrown out in court or have the romanticization that I am an artist and this is what I ought to do, and then realize that they're in far, far deeper shit than they can handle. But secondly, in many instances, it often means that the movie never even ends up being released in the first place when the government feels like this is propaganda that is harming the image of a specific group of people or of their own government in many instances. And I think that turns any opposition impact on good public messaging, on it providing information on authoritative dictatorships, because in many instances, it never even ends up being promoted. It just worsens the lives of these individuals. The second reason is because it often spreads misinformation and has a degree of lack of oversight. The first reason for this is because when it's made really quickly, you often do not have time to vet the kind of information you're putting through it. And often it's in the interest of the artist, like the actors or the filmmaker, to try and prioritize what looks aesthetic, what makes for a fun or punchy or really cool film, instead of what actually is like actually accurate in many instances, or they may be biased by their own perspective. And since there is a deluge or a large number of these films that can be released quite often because they're made in very low budgets, it's very easy for this to spread misinformation in large amounts. And crucially, a government cannot counteract for it very easily. Like most governments have limited budgets, they have to do many, many other things anyways. What does this mean? This leads to a lot of misinformation if even a few people watch any one guerrilla film anyways, and that's bad for a couple of reasons. One, it can lead to like problematic or bad crackdowns when the film does get popular, or it can change voting patterns. An example of this was a movie like Easy Rider that was made in a very tiny budget, and what ended up happening was that it released like really problematic stereotypes about counterculture and about how much like drugs people consume that often led to police crackdowns on minority or problem or like really poor communities within the American West, right? But secondly, even if this isn't watched by a large number of people, it leads to things like microaggression against other individuals. A person who sees a piece of misinformation because of I don't know, like Che Guevara's like guerrilla films in many instances can often lead them to think that it's justifiable to fight for violence, or like in many instances like it's okay to like harm other individuals who are seen as members of the minorities. So these sorts of misinformation happen a lot less with movies that are widely published, which means i.e. movies that often have a lot more money put behind them, and movies that often have to get permits permits in many instances because a lot more checks and balances to ensure that those movies are accurate anyways. The third reason is that they often are uniquely exploitative and coercive, right? Like there's just a huge principle of autonomy and privacy that's harmed over here. Many people ought to have the right to decide if they're going to be put into a movie that's released without their permission, right? Because it often creates a perception of that person that that person may not have may not wish to have in many instances. And in some instances, it's very directly invasive. Like sometimes you have to either invade this person's home or at least go publicly when this person just wants to enjoy their day, like, I don't know, drinking coffee in a cafe or something, and like having them be a part of a movie that they did not consent to be. They not only feel really, really horrified and terrible, but often individuals have a right to control their own body and the image in which that body is seen. For you to take that away from them and brutally put it up publicly is uniquely terrible. And often this even like is like really terrible experience for the artists themselves. Like for the skeleton crew, right? These people may think that it's romanticized or cool in order to make these such quick dash cam movies, but often it's really painful and tiring. Like trust me, it's really sweaty moving from one like a location to another very quickly. There's a lot of anxiety as you fear you're always going to be called out or caught. You often risk being hurt by the police when you're a young student who thinks that this is a cool thing to do, but realize it's much, much harder. So everyone really feels a lot worse for it. The fourth reason is because it often leads to crackdowns on the film industry itself. Because obviously, many, many other individuals who feel like their environment has been filmed without permission hate this. And it often taints the legitimacy of actually burgeoning film industries, like in like countries that often do not have that film industry, or for other film directors who may be doing things the legal or right way, but are seen as representatives of a film industry that's mostly composed of guerrilla films that do not take the permission of this. This leads to crackdowns on that industry, either by private industry, even either by private financiers who pull money out, or by the government who actively send police officers to like crack down any possible movie that could be made. This not only beats again any claims opposition has on dictatorships, but also is far more important. Like, look, maybe it is somewhat unclear that the dictatorship or authoritarian regime that it is shining light on is something it can actually cause meaningful change in, but it's very certain it harms many more people in the interim. I also think that this disrupts local communities who often haven't been given permission, right? So like you don't have a permit. So you often have to like go and harm or disrupt another person's day. You have to harm a community that often is, doing things that may have their own event anyways. And that is bad. What is the second thing I want to say? It also, I think, crowds out a lot of documentary movies that are just better, right? And there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, it's far, far cheaper and easier to make. So many more of it can be made and published on like viral social platforms like YouTube in many instances. So there's often far many more of it. And secondly, people have very limited attention spans, right? You have to go work a very long job. You often watch like, comedy movies or like fictional movies. So the amount of time you spend like going into the reality of a documentary film or a guerrilla film that may be documentary like is very limited, like all these sorts of films are very limited. So the point then is that this movie crowds out other kinds of movies like documentary movies that are far, far better. And the reason they're better is because they do have permits. They have far more public scrutiny on them. They're far more likely to be accurate and harm people less in the interim of making it. So independent harms that exist, and it often crowds out better movies anyways. Propose.
I'm going to be giving the LO. So we go. First, I'm going to try and weigh against the legal concerns. Then I'm going to attempt to afford three arguments. And if not, I don't get to the third one, you can listen about it in the extension. Three arguments are, one, why this increases the quality of content. Second, why this increases the quantity. Oh, sorry, flip that. Quantity of content and quality of content. And thirdly, why this is really good for individual actors. Before that, I want to quickly address the idea that, a lot of there are alternatives out there and that it's not necessarily going to be guerrilla filmmaking. I want to note that guerrilla filmmaking is probably the majority of low budget filmmaking that we're talking about in the status quo, because I don't even know what examples we can think of that are not guerrilla filmmaking, but also somewhat traditional filmmaking that require a lot of permits. Obviously, the micro budgets that we're talking about, or the skeleton crews that we're talking about, are characteristics of low budget filmmaking that overlaps with guerrilla filmmaking like massively, right? So a lot of the filmmaking that's low budget that we're talking about are guerrilla filmmaking, where you're requiring less permits, where you're requiring less budget, where you're putting less money into marketing, into legal stuff, all of that stuff. So the counterfactual or the alternative that Prop wants to talk about is probably very, very marginal. Majority of impact is still going to come down to guerrilla filmmakers or independent filmmakers who can often acquire less permit, who can often express their creative freedom more because there are less restrictions on these things. I want to quickly weigh against legal concerns because that's a big thing that pushing from Gov. I have two responses here. One, By OG's analysis, obviously people are afraid of breaking the law still, and they're still being afraid of being sued in public. It is likely that these guerrilla filmmakers already form communities of their own, that they're very aware of legal boundaries, that explicitly putting the face of someone on a piece of film that is not even an explicit concern given is probably something really, really bad and going to attract all the bad things the opposite government talks about. They obviously don't have the incentive to want the film industry to be cracked down upon. So obviously, they're likely to be cautious. I think that we can bite the bullet and say that is probably not the case, that they will go to the fullest extent to take care of all the legal concerns that can come about in filmmaking. But the types of things that are likely to do is probably not the worst forms of violations like privacy, but things like perhaps trespassing or filming in public spaces where they don't block everybody's face. But I think that those are things that often have way smaller scale and harms. Empirically, it is not the case that these things have sparked huge amounts of controversy and caused all the neighbors to be like, yeah, fuck them, kill the industry. It is often the case that they've been very careful. Maybe they're not the most careful compared to traditional production houses, but it is not the worst forms of violations that opposition wants to talk about. We think that creative freedom in these instances probably outweighs the legal concerns that are often not taken to the extent that governments would want to supercharge them. So, firstly, then, why do you just increase the quantity of content and why that's good? We want to note that it's very hard to enter traditional filmmaking in the status quo because of things like institutional biases, because of things like networking that you require into making those films in the first place. Guerrilla filmmaking lowers the barrier of entry because, one, there's obviously less cost to equipment, but secondly, more importantly, lower cost of marketing and having to hire reppy people because often you have to pay a lot of that in traditional filmmaking, but also just like a lot of the illegal stuff that you want to talk about, being extra careful in acquiring permit from local governments means that you have to put in a lot of money in doing that in the first place. Obviously, on our side, there's less of that problem because you don't need to necessarily opt in for the most expensive or most amount of legal protection. Why is this good? One, this breaks up monopoly on film, and that's a good thing because you force traditional production to often compete with you if a lot of these individual filmmakers are actually making content that people enjoy. You force them to rely less on marketing, actually improve the quality of their content. But secondly, you lead to more things being filmed on, and it's likely to be more timely as well because there are more forms of films that can be absorbed by people because in order to find a niche, you're likely to be filming different things that people actually care about. You know that you cannot often compete with traditional firms on the quality of marketing or your CGI or whatever. You're more likely to focus on things like storytelling and tell a different quantity of stories. Lastly, I'm not going to hinge our case on authoritarian states, but I would flag that a lot of times in semi-authoritarian states or in places where the film industry is not hugely developed, the crackdown the government wants to talk about doesn't happen because not having that industry is prior to that crackdown happening in the first place. And that's why a lot of people go into filmmaking in the first place because there's no option for them to opt into traditional film. They have to start with a small crew. They have to start with a small budget because there's no big budget to start with. These are people who are not filming topics that are often perceived to be popular and will sell well in the first place. These are industries that are not established yet. So guerrilla filmmaking is often the only option they have in a lot of these places. Secondly, though, why is this better for the quality of content? I think firstly, I want to establish there's incentive to produce good content, and this clashes with OG about the accuracy of information, etc., etc. I think that a lot of the times, majority of people who are guerrilla filmmakers are people that already have niche topics and often expertise in the topic that they want to explore. Most individuals make film because they have a topic that they're really interested in. They have incentive to represent those areas well because these are areas that they probably studied for a long time about, for example, or these are areas they're very interested in. But secondly, they're interested in making money and appealing to audience. Guerrilla filmmaking, especially, or filmmakers especially, are very prone to critiques from like film critiques or experts or people on YouTube even, because they often don't have the PR power to be like, actually, whatever you said is not true, which is why they're going to be extra careful in representing the nuanced perceptions of a lot of these things that they want to talk about, because they don't necessarily have the power to fight back against these criticisms, though they want to be extra careful to start with. We think that even if it's not the case that they have the best incentives in mind, in order to make money and in order to avoid a lot of these criticisms, they're likely to try to make these films good in the first place. There are 4 reasons why this is uniquely good compared to traditional films and why they're likely to produce good content. 1, there's more creative freedom and less institutional oversight, which means that filmmakers can often explore more niche or controversial subjects that risk being censored. I'm not even talking about hard censorship, but often soft censorship that makes it easier for you to put away ideas that were controversial in the first place. Secondly, lower cost also means that you can respond to more timely things because you can make a film a lot faster. The traditional filmmaking cycle is often like 6 months to a year. You can probably do it in 2 or 3 months. This means that it's a lot easier to put out content that's timely in the first place. Thirdly, you're likely to capture more raw and unpolished moments, and that often makes things a lot more genuine and relatable because often filmmakers over-index on the techniques in films, for example, and use other things to cover up flaws in their films. Obviously, on our side, we have incentive to make good content, but forcing them to be more creative by giving them less budget is actually a way that makes these content often really, really good. Lastly, similar idea, it actually often forces filmmakers to think creatively. We've seen in the past a lot of filmmakers or guerrilla filmmakers focus on shooting techniques or more clever storylines because often they can't rely on things like flashy things like CGI or marketing budget in order to cover those things up, which means these content actually becomes better. Obviously, this is important because we think that a lot of the time good content is what like is important about filmmaking in the first place and why people care about these things in the first place. The cost of trial and error is significantly lower on our side, so you actually get much more content that represents diverse types of topic that actually informs people in more things that otherwise would not exist in a counterfactual. Proud to oppose. Hi, so we're going into the training portion of this motion. So we're going to talk about a little bit about why we place this motion as novice semis, and then also talk about some general thoughts before going into talking about the extension ideas after the PMLO exchange. So really quickly, why we wanted to place this motion. The two big reasons are just one, we think that it's a good motion for a novice semis because it's although like relatively deep and very interesting, I think easy enough for a lot of teams who are new in debate to access a lot of the arguments, but also secondly mirrors the open semis where you're gonna know later what the open semis is about, but this like mirrors that, and we just wanted to do that for aesthetic purposes, so we thought it was an interesting motion to place here. Some general thoughts about the motion. I think that when we were testing this motion, the couple of big things. The first one is just delineating whether guerrilla filmmaking is just all types of low budget filmmaking, because there are all of arguments that you can access about just low budget filmmaking in general, but obviously guerrilla filmmaking is slightly different from that. And I think delineating that and then pointing out which impacts, for example, on Gov maps harder onto guerrilla filmmaking, which makes this debate clearer and more interesting, and also more balanced. And this is strategic to do on like either side as well. The second thing is maybe being more specific on who are the people who are guerrilla filmmakers and the content they're making as a result of that, right? So some of the stuff we thought of is like it could be students or it could be political activists who are making these films or documentaries, and that would be really interesting in analyzing the incentive, for example, for them making the information really accurate, or what are the type of techniques they're going to use in these films that makes it more accessible for people, et cetera, et cetera. So I think like the specificity onto who are the people who are making these films would make the impacts that like are downstream from that a lot clearer and interesting as well. And if other people have more thoughts.
It's also like a good soft motion before the finals one, which is a more like hard one. Um, okay. Yeah, I guess we can just delve into extension ideas. I'll do for CG and Bill can do for CO. So for closing comment, I think even though I feel I've probably like wrapped the fastest I have in a while, I feel there's still like a fair bit of extension material. So the first I think that is entirely untouched is sort of about the quality of these movies themselves. I think it's sort of empirically true a lot of them because they're low budget are not like either made very well or often are like made with like pretty low or like worse sort of cameras. This might at first seem a little difficult to weigh against the top arguments, but I feel there are a number of things. So one, which is, I think you can note that like a lot of people who may face legal risks are either unlikely to face them very frequently, like only a percentage of these films get sued, both because the people suing them know they can't get much money, and also because it's pretty expensive to go through the lawsuit process, especially in like a lot of developing nations where like they have very, very long like court systems. And the second thing is like the quality of art can have like a couple of pretty important implications. So firstly, if this is about political dissidence, it may unironically just be like a pretty bad way to sell the message. So, like, even if the message may be good or worth critiquing the authoritarian regime for, often it really reduces the legitimacy if the kind of movie you're make. It's like it's work or because it's like a short because you just like had to tell random pieces of stories elsewhere. There are also just general impacts on like how this makes people feel about like watching actually accurate movies like documentaries. So that's one idea. The second thing is, as Belle hinted at before, there are very clear differences to make between this short films and I think also the news. So, for example, a lot of op is going to, I think, come around like the kind of valuable information you get from guerrilla filmmaking you can't get elsewhere. And I think attempting to mitigate a pushback against that by talking, say, the value of news articles or what short films do for students, for example, is pretty helpful. The third idea I think is some of the arguments I've explained, I think are like quite like kind of underbaked. So one of them is I think the principle. So I've like sort of a little generally talked about how like the principle of autonomy is important, the right to privacy is important, without explaining why it's important or why it is more important than pragmatic material. And then secondly, I just mentioned a pragmatic impact, which is like people feel bad about this. So both of that I think require a lot more work. For example, some of the burdens to additionally meet is like why is the right to privacy in this way so essential? Like why, for example, makes it different? Why does it make guerrilla films different from, say, I don't know, like social media posts that others put about you and stuff like that? And then I think secondly, which is like, why is this right to privacy like more important than other pragmatic concerns? That's one thing. But there are also like a lot of other pragmatic stuff to say. So, for example, the disruptions to community, I think, can use a lot more important picture painting that I don't provide. So, for example, what does it mean for you as a community to make an event and just have people who like may not be experienced in filmmaking, may not even like know what it is to like suddenly just come and disrupt your day? At minimum, it can just make your own day feel a lot worse. But at worst, it can actively like lead to things like tensions on the street and that sort of stuff, and that can have pretty bad like bad things to say. The final thing I'll note is just to be like use like just to note some like mechanistic stuff. So for example, when you're making claims on misinformation, you may have noticed, I think as Bell pointed out, that a lot of my argument is kind of incentive oriented, and you can make it far more capacity oriented. So for example, if you have a micro budget and a skeleton crew, the amount the ability to try and do things like research on every piece of info you have is very limited because you don't have enough people doing that research additionally, right? Or just the fact that you don't have enough fact checkers to go and check in your information afterwards, or even the process of getting a permit often asks like people, like say for example, I want to like make a movie about like oceanography or like about climate change. Sometimes like getting permits to film in like those colleges is really helpful because they can just give you like really useful pieces of feedback once they see your script. And that sort of stuff is just like much harder to do if you choose guerrilla filmmaking as the way you want to do it, right? And just take information. If anything, you might be like closer to like a conspirator who like thinks that like a conspiracy theorist who thinks that like I don't know, like the deep state of like science or something is out to get you. So I feel there's like a lot of additional stuff to say. Even if you think that my arguments are like reasonably backed out. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think on CO, there are probably two large areas that I would think about. The first is I would be a lot more explicit compared to how I did it in my speech of like what are really like the exclusive benefits of like extra creativity or extra quality of content that you really get from guerrilla filmmaking. I think that's important because it supercharges the weighing against the legal concerns that I think of would probably push back on, right? Just like being more explicit on like maybe even going hard line and in some instances why violation of like certain like the trespassing in some place is actually really crucial for that content even getting exposure in the first place or being filmed on in the first place. Obviously that's like a very really relatively extreme example and Ob is taking a really hard line here, but I think there are like margins and like degrees to how you can do this. The idea here is I think the missing burden in my speech was not being super explicit about what is so like good about like having low budget, so good with like a smaller crew, et cetera, that helps because essentially it's going to be important for like weighing against like the gov concerns of like legal risks or like this content not being as good as it would be or crowding out other more meaningful content. I think you just to prove that the content that comes about from guerrilla filmmaking is just more meaningful, and that's structural from the way that guerrilla filmmaking like happens. And then the second part I would talk about is so obviously I think authoritarian states was just like something that I flagged. I think that there's a lot of room for extension here of like how there's a lack of content going around and why this is explicitly going to be a unique way to fill in that gap. Gov obviously gave a lot of like preemptive material as to how like this is unlikely to have an effect anyways. I think you just try to run the flip side of that, which is just like, no, there is a meaningful difference. Exactly because there's less process of going through permits, because you can film in places that you otherwise cannot if you were like if you had to ask for like, a permit from the state. And that's why you actually get a lot more of that content where there's just like no alternative in a lot of these places. But I think you obviously have to be very clear about the margin here as well. I guess it's kind of a third thing, but I clumped it together as a second thing here. The biggest third thing I think, which is a nice extension, is talking about how a lot of people don't really have like options when it comes to like places where film industries are not set up. So not necessarily authoritarian states or semi-authoritarian states, but just like even like in relatively like liberal places where like the film industry is just not very developed. I think there's like a lot of content here about how like you actually introduce a lot of filmmakers. There's like a very maybe like pretty strong and clear extension on how like a lot of actors or actresses just like don't have anything on their CV. And it's just they have to participate in things like guerrilla filmmaking to even like build up their experience in the first place and participate in other whatever more high budget, meaningful content that Gov wants to talk about, right? So like framing guerrilla filmmaking not as like the opposite or the alternative to like traditional filmmaking, but like kind of the precursor or like the step before you get into filmmaking, which makes it hard, like easier to present why you shouldn't oppose it. So I think like there's a lot of content there as well. It's not exclusive to authoritarian states, but I think like maybe it is like maybe the margin's bigger in places where like the film industry is not very developed. There's super high barrier of entry, especially in places like authoritarian states.
I'll make one quick other note. I feel a lot of these media motions in general, they often have like a lot of steps to access an impact that I think neither of us have fully covered. For example, like if you just think about watching a movie, right? Like somebody goes, they make a movie with like a script writer, they film it with a couple of actors, they edit it. But then even after the movie comes, right, it is released, a person watches that specific movie and then they have some change in their behavior. The reason I know this probably fairly intuitive thing is like almost most of those steps of that entire process reveal some kind of argumentation. So for example, like how does this affect what kind of movies get made when it's guerrilla films, right? Like what type of topics do they cover? For example, a person, how do they internalize this when they see the movie? What is the precise psychological change? What type of person is it likely to change? What do they go out into the world with, right? Like what do they do in their behavior that's different if they've seen like a few meaningful guerrilla films that they haven't been able to before? So I only mention that because like I think a lot of the impacting around how this changes people's behavior comes down to that level of precision in how exactly the mech flows into that impact. So that's also like a pretty helpful area for extending it. But yeah, that's it. Thanks all. See you in the next training, I
That's
guess.
it. Bye bye.